I want you to picture a specific moment in history. It's September 1796. George Washington is worn out, he's done with the presidency, and he publishes his farewell address. He basically looks at the American people and says, "Look, we are a young, fragile republic. Whatever you do, do not get dragged into Europe's mess. Stay in your lane, stay independent."
It was the ultimate "it's not you, it's me" breakup letter to the rest of the world. And for a long time, that was the golden rule of American foreign policy. Isolationism wasn't just a strategy, it was an identity.
Right, but here is the wild part. Fast forward just over a century to 1919, a mere blink of an eye in historical terms. And where is the American president? He isn't at Mount Vernon tending to his crops. Woodrow Wilson is in Paris, literally sitting at the head of the table, redrawing the map of Europe and trying to design a global government.
It is a massive, almost schizophrenic shift. I mean, we went from leave us alone to we are here to fix the entire planet in, roughly 3 generations.
That shift from the hermit nation to the global policeman is what we are unpacking today. We're looking at the era between 1890 and 1919. The sources we've pulled for this deep dive describe it as the story of a nation going through a chaotic puberty.
That is actually a perfect analogy. If 1796 America was a shy freshman trying to avoid eye contact in the hallway, by 1898, we had become the loud, overconfident sophomore who just got a varsity jacket and thinks they run the school.
I love that, the sophomore surge. But usually when a nation changes its personality that drastically, something triggers it. You don't just wake up one day and decide to conquer the Philippines. So looking at the history texts and the economic data we have, what was the catalyst?
Well, you have to look at the psychological crisis of 1890. For the entire 19th century, the American story was about manifest destiny. Go west. Conquer the wild. There was always a horizon to chase. But in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau released a report that basically said, that's it, the frontier is closed. There is no more unorganized territory.
That sounds like a bureaucratic footnote, but the sources say people really freaked out about this.
They did. A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner published this famous thesis arguing that the frontier was what made us American. It gave us our grit, our democracy, our distinct character. So when the Census Bureau said, it's gone, it triggered an identity crisis. If we aren't expanding, are we stagnating? Are we dying?
So we had this existential panic, but wasn't there a more practical wallet-hitting problem too? I was looking at the trade numbers in the stack, and the U.S. was producing a ridiculous amount of goods.
Exactly. This is the glut thesis. We were industrializing so fast that American factories and farms were producing way more than the American people could actually consume. We had a surplus of everything: steel, wheat, cotton. If you don't find new people to buy that stuff, your economy crashes.
So the shy freshman didn't just want to meet new people, he needed customers.
Precisely. And that economic itch is what turned our eyes toward the Pacific, specifically toward Hawaii.
Now, this is a story that I think gets glossed over in high school history. We usually hear that Hawaii joined the U.S., but the documents here paint a much darker picture involving sugar barons.
Oh, it was absolutely a coup. You had American businessmen who had effectively taken over the Hawaiian economy to grow sugar. For a long time, they had a sweet deal, pun intended, where they could export sugar to the U.S. without paying tariffs. But when that deal was threatened, and when Queen Liliuokalani tried to restore political power to the native Hawaiians, the businessmen didn't negotiate.
They called in the muscle.
They staged an overthrow of the monarchy and immediately petitioned the U.S. for annexation. They wanted to be part of the U.S., so their sugar would be domestic, not foreign. Now, President Grover Cleveland was actually horrified by this. He called it a violation of national honor and refused to annex them.
But that hesitation didn't last long, because you can't have a global trading empire if you can't protect your ships. And this brings us to one of the most influential figures in this whole stack of research, Alfred Thayer Mahan.
You cannot overstate Mahan's influence. He wasn't a politician. He was a naval officer and a historian. He wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, and his argument was simple. Look at Britain. How do they run the world? A massive navy. If the U.S. wants to sit at the grown-ups table, we need a modern steel fleet.
And modern is the key word there. The sources describe the U.S. fleet in the 1880s as the old Navy, basically rotting wooden leftovers from the Civil War. We were a laughingstock.
We were. But Mahan didn't just argue for bigger guns. He argued for logistics. This is the part people miss. If you switch from wind-powered wooden ships to steam-powered steel ships, you were tethered to coal. A steamship without coal is just a floating target. You need coaling stations, you need gas stations across the ocean.
Which suddenly makes islands like Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico look a lot less like vacation spots and a lot more like strategic necessities.
Exactly. So by 1898, the stage is set. You have the economic need for markets, you have the psychological need for a new frontier, you have the military need for bases. You just needed a spark to blow the whole thing up.
And that spark was Cuba, or rather, the USS Maine in Cuba. But before things blew up, the American public was already primed for war, right? I mean, the newspapers were going wild.
This is the golden age of yellow journalism. You had titans like Hearst and Pulitzer fighting for circulation numbers. They realized that atrocity stories sold papers. And to be fair, the Spanish were being brutal in Cuba. General Weyler was herding civilians into concentration camps where thousands died of disease.
So Americans are reading these horrific stories over breakfast, feeling that moral outrage. We identified with the Cubans, right? They were fighting for independence from a European monarchy, just like we did in 1776.
We saw ourselves in them. But then, on February 15, 1898, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. 260 American sailors die.
And the papers immediately scream, "Spanish treachery! Remember the Maine!" But do we actually know that Spain did it?
Almost certainly not. I mean, modern investigations suggest it was a coal bunker fire that ignited the ammunition magazine, a tragic accident. But in 1898, facts were secondary to the narrative. The public demanded war, and Congress declared it.
And here is where that sophomore swagger really kicks in. Secretary of State John Hay famously called it a splendid little war. That is a wild thing to call a war.
It reflects the mood. It was short, about 10 weeks, and it was a blowout. The new steel navy that Mahan asked for, it absolutely decimated the Spanish fleets in the Philippines and the Caribbean. It was the debutante ball for American military power.
But when the smoke cleared, the U.S. was left holding a very awkward prize. We went to war to liberate Cuba, but we ended up owning Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. We bought the Philippines for $20 million.
That was the moment the U.S. officially became an empire, and it sparked a massive, bitter debate at home. We gloss over this now, but there was a huge movement called the Anti-Imperialist League. You had Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, strange bedfellows, all arguing that you cannot be a democracy at home and a tyrant abroad. Twain wrote these scathing essays asking how we could possibly govern a people without their consent. It went against the Declaration of Independence.
But the expansionists won the argument, and their logic was, well, it was steeped in that sophomore arrogance, the idea of the white man's burden.
Yes, the belief in American exceptionalism. The argument was that we weren't conquering the Filipinos for our benefit, but for theirs. President McKinley literally said he prayed to God and was told to take the islands to educate the Filipinos and uplift and civilize and Christianize them, which was ironic considering most Filipinos had been Catholic for centuries under the Spanish.
So we crushed the Filipino independence movement, which, by the way, was a brutal, bloody counterinsurgency war that cost way more lives than the splendid little war. And now the U.S. has colonies. We are a global player.
We are on the world stage, and now we need a leader who embodies this new, muscular America. Enter Theodore Roosevelt.
The man, the myth, the mustache. He becomes president in 1901, and everyone knows his catchphrase, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." But let's dig into what that actually meant policy-wise. It sounds cool, but how did it work?
It meant that the U.S. was done asking for permission. TR fundamentally changed the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the original doctrine just said, Europe, stay out of our hemisphere. It was a defensive. Roosevelt added what we call the Roosevelt Corollary.
Which turned the U.S. into the policeman of the hemisphere.
Correct. He reasoned that if we don't want Europe interfering in Latin American countries when they don't pay their debts, then we have to be the ones to step in and make them pay. We became the debt collector, the sheriff, and the judge.
And we weren't subtle about it. I mean, look at the Panama Canal. We wanted a canal. Colombia, which owned Panama, said, no thanks, the price is too low. So what did TR do? He didn't keep negotiating?
No, he essentially engineered a revolution. He let the Panamanians know that if they declared independence, the U.S. Navy would be there to protect them. We parked warships off the coast, blocking Colombian troops from landing to stop the rebellion. Panama becomes a country, and days later, they signed the Canal Treaty.
That is bold. It's effective, but it's brazen.
It's the definition of big stick diplomacy. We got the canal, which was vital for moving our navy between oceans, but we created a century of resentment in Latin America.
Now, Roosevelt is a tough act to follow. But in 1909, we get William Howard Taft, and he tries a different approach. He doesn't want to use the stick as much. He wants to use the wallet, dollar diplomacy.
Right. His slogan was, "Substitute dollars for bullets." The theory was, let's encourage American banks to invest in Latin America and Asia. If we build their railroads and buy their bonds, we stabilize them, we make money, and we gain influence without firing a shot.
But the critique in the source material is pretty harsh. It says dollar diplomacy was largely a trap. How so?
Well, think about the mechanics. American banks lend millions to a country like Nicaragua, but then maybe the Nicaraguan government collapses or they can't pay the interest. The banks don't just say, oh, well. They go to the White House and say, hey, our assets are at risk.
So Taft has to send in the Marines anyway to protect the money.
Exactly. The dollars paved the way for the bullets. We ended up occupying Nicaragua, Haiti, and the Dominican Republic for years, largely to secure these financial interests.
Yeah.
It created this cycle of debt and occupation that actually made the regions less stable, not more.
And it also rubbed other major powers the wrong way. The sources mention that Taft trying to buy influence in Manchuria really ticked off the Japanese.
It did. Japan felt the U.S. was trying to buy its way into their backyard. It accelerated the tension between the U.S. and Japan that would eventually, decades later, explode in WWII.
So Taft's term ends, and in 1913 we get Woodrow Wilson. Now, this is where the story gets really complex. Wilson runs as a progressive. He criticizes the imperialism of TR and Taft. He talks about morality and human rights. You'd expect him to bring the troops home.
That is the Wilson paradox. He spoke like a preacher, but he acted like a policeman. In fact, Wilson intervened militarily in Latin America more than Roosevelt and Taft combined.
That's staggering.
Because of his moral certainty. He believed it was America's duty to teach other nations how to be democratic. There's that sophomore attitude again, the belief that we know better. Look at Mexico.
Oh, the hapless cowboy situation.
It was a disaster. Mexico was going through a violent revolution. A general named Huerta took power in a coup. Most nations recognized him just to keep trade flowing. Wilson refused. He said, I am going to teach the South American republics to elect good men.
Which is incredibly condescending.
It is. And it led to him ordering the U.S. Navy to seize the port of Veracruz. Later, after the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa attacked a town in New Mexico, Wilson sent General Pershing and thousands of troops into northern Mexico to hunt him down.
So you have the U.S. Army wandering around the Mexican desert, failing to catch one guy, while Wilson is lecturing the world on sovereignty.
It showed the limits of American power. We looked incompetent. But while we were playing in the sand in Mexico, the real storm had broken in Europe. 1914, World War I begins.
And initially, Wilson goes back to the George Washington playbook. He urges Americans to be neutral in thought and action. But looking at the financial records, were we ever really neutral?
In spirit? Maybe. Economically? Absolutely not. The British Royal Navy blockaded Germany, so we couldn't trade with them. But our trade with Britain and France skyrocketed. We became the warehouse for the Allied war effort.
And the banker.
That's the critical piece. J.P. Morgan and other U.S. banks lent billions of dollars to the Allies. If Britain and France lost the war, those loans would default, and the American banking system would collapse. So whether the average American knew it or not, our wallet was already in the trench with the Allies.
But Wilson manages to keep us out of the fighting for a long time. He even wins re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war."
Which is one of history's great ironies, because barely a month after his second inauguration, we were in.
What was the tipping point? Was it just the submarines?
The submarines were the pressure, but the Zimmermann telegram was the trigger. Germany, getting desperate, sent a coded message to Mexico. It basically said, if you ally with us and attack the United States, we will help you reconquer your lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona.
That is a wild proposal. It's like a movie plot.
It was an act of war. When British intelligence intercepted it and handed it to Wilson, it was game over. The threat wasn't across the ocean anymore. It was on the border. But notice how Wilson frames the war declaration. He doesn't say, we are fighting to save our banks, or even, we are fighting because of the telegram.
He says the world must be made safe for democracy.
He transforms the war into a moral crusade. It's the ultimate expression of that sophomore confidence. We aren't just fighting a country, we are fighting for a universal ideal.
The U.S. troops, the Doughboys, arrive, and they tip the balance. The war ends in November 1918, and Wilson becomes the first American president to travel to Europe while in office. He goes to Paris to negotiate the peace treaty, and he is treated like a messiah.
The crowds in Paris were insane. They threw flowers at him. He had his 14 points, which was this blueprint for a new world order, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and a League of Nations to prevent war. He wanted a peace without victory.
But the guys sitting across the table, Clemenceau of France, Lloyd George of Britain, they weren't idealists. They were angry seniors who had just survived a bar fight.
Exactly. They had lost a generation of men. They didn't want a new world order. They wanted revenge. They wanted to punish Germany. So the Treaty of Versailles became a harsh, punitive document. Wilson had to compromise on almost everything just to save his baby, the League of Nations.
He pinned everything on the League. He thought, okay, the treaty is flawed, but the League will fix it later. But then he had to come home and sell it to the U.S. Senate. And this is where the sophomore hits a wall.
He hit a wall of brick-hard isolationism. The Senate, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, looked at Article X of the League Covenant. It said that member nations had to protect each other's independence. To the Senate, that sounded like the U.S. Army will be at the beck and call of a committee in Geneva.
They felt it stripped Congress of its power to declare war.
Right. They weren't willing to give up sovereignty. Wilson refused to compromise. He went on a whistle-stop tour across the country to try and rally the people, but he had a massive stroke. He was incapacitated. The Senate voted down a treaty. The U.S. never joined the League of Nations.
It's a tragic ending to the arc. We build the car and then refuse to drive it. And by 1920, the mood in the country had totally shifted again.
The year 1919 was a nightmare. You had the Spanish flu killing hundreds of thousands. You had race riots in dozens of cities. You had a Red Scare with bombings and raids. Americans looked at the world, looked at the chaos, and said, "We are done. We are exhausted."
And that's why Warren G. Harding won the 1920 election in a landslide. His slogan wasn't about saving the world, it was a return to normalcy.
Which is barely even proper grammar, but it was exactly what people wanted to hear. The sophomore wanted to go home, take off the varsity jacket, and play video games in the basement.
But, and this is the big takeaway from our deep dive, could we really go back?
No. That's the tragedy of the 1920s. We pretended to be isolationist. We stayed out of the League, but economically. We were the world's creditor, militarily. We still had troops in Hades and the Philippines. We had built a navy that was second to none. The U.S. had graduated. We were a superpower, whether we wanted to admit it or not.
The tools were all there, the big stick, the dollar diplomacy, the moral rhetoric of saving democracy. We kept using them, just without the official labels.
We did. And that brings us to the uncomfortable question that lingers from this era. Wilson argued that because American values were superior, we had a moral imperative to intervene.
Right, it's not conquest, it's help.
But once you convince yourself of that your way is the only right way, is it even possible to be neutral? Or does that belief in American exceptionalism make intervention inevitable?
It feels like we're still answering that question every single day.
We are. The sophomore never really left the building.
That is a wrap on our deep dive into America's awkward growth spurt. Thanks for unpacking it with me.
Always a pleasure to look back.